Good day to you. And did you go to a New Year's Eve party and then post a photo of a friend on Facebook? It's very likely that you did. And probably, if that person wanted to sue you for invasion of privacy, they could. Especially if you took the photo inside of their house and they didn't give you permission. In actual fact, that doesn't really happen that often, that somebody sues somebody for a Facebook photo, but it does point out that the law, when it comes to media, is still very present in our lives. And that's what this chapter is all about, chapter 13 on media law. We'll be covering law in this instructor video, not so much in the details of the laws, which we'll let you read in the chapter, but in the broad outlines of what the laws are designed to achieve. So let's start with the most important law of the land, and that important law is the First Amendment. The First Amendment is the core of all laws that govern the media. The First Amendment you should read in yourself. You will have to Google it because unfortunately the book doesn't print the entire wording of the law. But yes, it's about free expression, but it's really prohibiting the abridgment, which is curtailing or tamping down of free expression in a variety of forms, in public settings, expression when it comes to religion, expression when it comes to individual speech. That's what the First Amendment is all about. It's prohibiting the abridgment of expression. And that law applies not only to individuals like yourself. You could stand up and you could say the President of the United States is a moron, and you're not going to be convicted of libel, of slandering the President. That's your right to free speech. The First Amendment covers not only the individual, but it also covers the media. The media, in terms of the content that is produced for television, radio, newspapers, etc., is treated as an expression of the First Amendment. Now, originally in the United States, media were not free. They were under control. The original media were newspapers, and they had to be licensed in the colonies to the British Crown. And the British Crown would monitor those newspapers very closely, and if there was a lot of criticism of Britain from the United States or the colonies, then the newspaper would be shut down. The license would be suspended. So originally we had control of the media. But one of the very first court cases to start to break that control was the Zenger case. The Zenger case involved a newspaper that Zenger, a guy by the name of Zenger, was putting out called the New York Journal. It was in 1733, and it used to criticize the governor of New York. And the governor decided he was going to punish Zenger by throwing him in jail. So he threw the editor of the newspaper in jail, and he charged him with seditious libel. That's a kind of way of saying being a traitor and also smearing somebody's reputation, because he said that the governor was appointing justices under favoritism and not appointing them under their merits. Well, the court went to trial, and Zenger was acquitted of seditious libel. So that was one of the first times that we have a court case that is opening up the way for media to operate on their own and to not have to be controlled by government entities like a governor. In 1791, the Bill of Rights was ratified. You can read the Bill of Rights. It added a lot of individual freedoms to the Constitution, and that helped establish that media also would have certain freedoms when it comes to expressing itself. So in the late 1700s, we start to see this movement away from media being controlled. However, media still are controlled today. If we jump fast forward to the year 2001, we have the Patriot Act. The Patriot Act was passed, and it provides for the right of the government to survey people in the name of keeping the nation safe. So today, if you make a phone call to Dubai in the Middle East or Egypt, it's very likely that your phone call is being monitored in terms of who you are calling and perhaps even being listened in on. That's all courtesy of the Patriot Act, making it possible for the government to monitor communication with foreign entities, especially those foreign areas of the world that are considered to be a threat to U.S. security. So the Patriot Act is one area where the law has enabled government to curtail media content and to prohibit or abridge first expression. Now let's move on to a whole slew of laws that generally fall under the category of protection of individuals. The laws are designed to protect individuals from being harmed. In some cases that means control, in other cases that means freedom. Let's start with the first one, which is libel, and its subdivision of defamation. Libel is all about hurting somebody's reputation to the extent that they lose income, or they're not able to get a promotion, or they sustain emotional damage that they seek counseling for and have a hard time being healthy in life mentally. This all has to do with when you say something about somebody. Now, celebrities and public officials, they have a higher standard. That means that you are allowed to say things about the Kardashians or about Lindsay Lohan or about whoever you want, and you can be wrong and you can hurt their reputation because there's a higher standard. Because the law says that if celebrities are going to use media to promote themselves and to become famous, then they also have to accept that there's going to be some unwarranted criticism of them. But for the average individual, you can mount a libel defense if somebody goes on the radio and claims that you're a drunk and you're not, or if somebody goes on the radio and claims that you have AIDS and you do not. These are factual inaccuracies that could hurt a person's reputation and their standing in the community and their income, etc. So that's where a libel lawsuit comes into play. Now, there are 3 defenses against libel if you're a media representative, like a journalist or a reporter. One is, if you report something bad about somebody that hurts their reputation and it's the truth, then generally that's a defense. If what you wrote is true, that's okay. The second thing is privilege. That is, was the information stated in a private setting that you did not have permission to release that information to? For example, proceedings in Congress. Those are often, if they are behind closed doors, those are often not privileged information. A meeting between you and your psychologist or you and your doctor, that's not privileged information if somebody overhears it by passing outside of a window. Privileged information often basically boils down to whether the information was confidential or not. And thirdly, the other defense in a libel lawsuit is you can claim that what you said was an opinion, it's not a fact. And so opinions are allowed to be circulated in American media. It's said to be healthy for democracy. The next area of law that I want to talk about is invasion of privacy. There's that famous case of Dr. Sam Shepard, and not that particular case. I'm going to come to that case in a minute. But invasion of privacy has to do with intrusion. That's physically going into somebody's space and taking photographs if you didn't have permission, breaking into their apartment, for example. Embarrassment, portraying somebody in a way that embarrasses them. False light, portraying them in a way that is untrue. If you're a journalist and you go out to the scene of to a crime scene where there's been an arrest of some crack suspects at a house, and you're shooting video and a college student happens to walk past that house on their way home, and then you show the video on a news report, it could be a false light situation. The college student innocently walking past is associated with this crack house. It could be a false light case. And finally, misappropriation. Misappropriation is taking somebody's image and using it to make money without their permission. It would be like taking Tiger Woods, for example, and using it to have a golf fundraiser for your local community organization. Even though it's nonprofit, if you don't have his permission, it's misappropriation. It's using his image without his permission. All right, now let's go on to free press and fair trial. That's the next area of protection of individuals. This does involve the Sam Shepard case, a case where a doctor was accused of killing his wife, and he reported that there was a bushy-haired intruder that was the person who was responsible for his wife's death. The case had a lot of racial overtones, the bushy-haired intruder seemingly indicating it was an African American. But the press went wild. They accused Dr. Sam Shepard of lying, of disappearing, of having lots of contradictions in his statements. And ultimately, Dr. Sam Shepard was acquitted because it was ruled that he did not have a free trial. So you're entitled to a free trial. You're entitled to an unbiased jury. You're entitled to be able to take the fifth and not incriminate yourself. These are all various sub-laws of this free press fair trial designed to give the average individual some protection. Then there's the area of law called prior restraint. Prior restraint has to do with forcing a media organization not to publish or broadcast something. And there's the case of Neer versus Minnesota and the school district that was involved there, and you can read about that. And there's the case of the Pentagon Papers, where the New York Times decided to publish some military secrets from the Vietnam War. And eventually the court ruled that, well, it's acceptable to publish these. It's in the interest of democracy in discovering truth, even though it may violate some security of the Army. And so prior restraint is something that is in play, and sometimes media organizations are allowed to publish what they want. Sometimes they have to challenge the courts. Other times they are restricted from not publishing what they want because it will harm national security or will harm the reputation of a person. Next up, we have the area of free speech and students. There is the Hazelwood versus Kuhlmeyer case, a high school student newspaper that decided to publish a story on underage sex and sex among students that had divorced parents. And there was the case that was brought against the school district that because the school district decided not to publish those stories. They ruled that even though the names of the females in the stories were anonymous, and therefore they could not be identified, that still somebody could figure out who the females were by the way that the stories were written. So the school newspaper blocked out parts of the stories, and the students behind the newspaper sued the school, and they lost. The courts ruled that if a newspaper or other student medium is under the advisement of an academic curriculum, then the advisor to the newspaper, the advisor to the radio station, the advisor to the TV has the right to, in essence, censor that newspaper. So there's a loss of free speech there. Then we have the idea of journalists in jail. Journalists can be put in jail for not revealing their sources. It's an area where journalists have a lot of pride in. A lot of journalists live by the mantra that they can keep their sources confidential, otherwise the sources would not talk and would not offer information. That was the case of why Watergate happened, where President Nixon in the 1970s had to step down from office because somebody within his administration was giving information to the press, revealing that Richard Nixon's campaign staff had broken into the Democratic headquarters in the Watergate Hotel in Washington, D.C., to try and find out what the Democrat strategy was. That source, known as Deep Throat, that's what he wanted to go by, was not given up until after he died by the journalist Bob Woodward, working for the Washington Post. That journalist kept that secret all those years until Deep Throat died. And he was entitled to do that because most laws protect journalists. They're called shield laws, shielding them from government forcing them to give up sources. But in the case of imminent danger, if a journalist has information from a source that there's going to be a military attack from a foreign nation, then the courts could force the journalist to give up that source. Then we come to the area of obscenity. Obscenity is a very tricky area for media. We know that in general, the United States media are more controlled when it comes to obscenity. In Europe, you can typically see nudity almost every single night on television if it's part of the plot. But in the United States, we protect very strongly against nudity, profanity, and other kinds of material that is considered to be obscene. The famous court case Roth versus the United States, Roth being a person who used to mail pornographic content through the U.S. Postal Service, established that in order to prove that material is obscene, number one, community standards have to determine that material is obscene. So what is obscene in New York City is going to be very different from what is obscene in Arkansas. You can assume that it's going to be more conservative in Arkansas, and therefore the content might be obscene in Arkansas. If it's, for example, a naked female or use of the word ass in radio, that might violate a community standard in Arkansas. Secondly, the material has to be taken as a whole. If you're talking about an ass, and the ass is within the context of referring to body parts that are part of a human anatomy, and it's basically a biology lesson, and when you get to a person's buttocks, you say, oh, some people call this an ass. Okay, that's not going to be considered obscene, probably because taken as a whole, the material was more about educating people about somebody's anatomy. And then we come to the last area, which is prurient interest. Very strange word there, prurient interest, P-R-U-R-I-E-N-T, interest. It has to do with strange or unusual interests, primitive interests, without getting too graphic. It could have to do with things like bestiality or voyeurism or urges of rape. This is a portrayal of, say, unusual sexual desire, and that would be considered to be a violation of obscenity. Next, we come to the area of law that has to do with the regulation of media. And one of those areas of regulation is where the chapter started out with, talking about Barbara Ringer working down there in the U.S. Library of Congress and how she worked so hard to establish copyright law for artists and people who create content in the media. And basically, the law as it stands because of her is if you create a song, for example, and that song makes it on the radio, or if you create a website and that website is very successful and there's something unique about that website, you have copyright over that for 50 years after your death. And that means that people cannot use that without gaining permission, especially if they're making money. If they're making money, then they absolutely have to gain permission. If they're not making money, there is an area of the law called fair use. Academics use it all the time. We want to show bits and pieces of movies in class. We want to show bits and pieces of TV shows so that our students can learn. And that's considered a fair use. It's all under the copyright and fair use law. Generally speaking, broadcasting has become less regulated over the years. It used to be so tightly regulated before 1996, especially when the Telecommunications Act came in. Prior to that act, radio and TV stations had to announce news. They had to compile quarterly lists of how they were serving the community with their content. They had to not own more than a certain number of TV and radio stations. Companies could not own more so that they didn't dominate the market. All of that went away in 1996. In 1996, the Telecommunications Act made it possible for fewer companies to own more media. They did away with the news requirement, and they did away with just a lot of regulations, freeing broadcasters up to produce content. Of course, broadcasters are still controlled in the area of obscenity. They cannot commit obscenity or indecency, otherwise they could be susceptible to a $325,000 fine. $325,000 for letting a profanity slip. Now the chapter finishes with regulation of the internet. You can see two major attempts to try and regulate the internet. We had the Decency Act, and then we also had the Digital Divide Act, or Net Neutral, or Net Zero, as it is also called, Act. These acts tried to, first of all, prohibit pornography on the internet and other forms of indecency. That's what the Decency Act did. And in the case of the Net Neutrality Act, it tried to make it illegal for companies not to provide equal broadband access to certain areas of the country that didn't have it, mostly urban and poor areas, but also rural areas. Both of these acts failed. The internet, unlike other media, so far has a strong history of being free from regulation. Of course, there are certain things that you can't do on the internet, otherwise you can get traced. I mean, there's somebody posted on Facebook about his drinking and driving. You can look it up, and he was arrested for that. So the internet does have some curtailment, but generally speaking, it is a free medium, especially when you consider that in the dark internet, where you can hire assassins to kill people and purchase illegal drugs and engage in child prostitution. It's the Wild West on the internet. We'll see if that's going to be the case as we go forward, especially if we find that some people are being harmed in ways that bring public attention across the scope of the world to their cases, and the public finally becomes so outraged that they file a lawsuit and the courts allow some regulation of the internet. But right now the internet tends to be a very free medium. So there you have it. That will wrap up our chapter on media law. Have a great day.